Warning. This chapter contains themes that may be disturbing or unsuitable for some viewers. Proceeding is at your discretion, as the author cannot be held responsible for any reactions beyond this point. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Chapter 3. Part 1. Now properly equipped from Thomas's suggestion, Elizabeth took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the industrial-grade flashlight in her hand. The weight of it was reassuring, solid against her palm as she checked the batteries one final time. Each member of their group had done the same, meticulously inspecting their equipment before venturing back into the nightmare that was Deadwood Vale. "Everyone ready?" Michael asked, his voice steady despite the fear they all felt churning in their stomachs. Jonas nodded, adjusting the straps of his backpack filled with extra batteries, first aid supplies, and several additional light sources. "As ready as we'll ever be." Gabriella crossed herself quickly, a gesture none of them had seen her make before. "For Ryder," she whispered. "For Ryder," they echoed in unison. The drive to the edge of Deadwood Vale was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The headlights of David's truck cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead but doing little to dispel the dread that had settled over them like a shroud. As they approached the perimeter of the forest, Elizabeth felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The memory of Ryder's distorted face and that horrifying, inhuman voice still haunted her. But beneath the fear was something stronger: determination. She couldn't leave him trapped in there, possessed by some ancient devil. "Look," Penelope pointed as they parked the truck a safe distance from the tree line. "The police are gone." David frowned, peering through the windshield. "That can't be right. After finding those bodies, they should have had this place surrounded." "Maybe they're further in," Jonas suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it either. They exited the truck, the cool night air raising goosebumps on Elizabeth's arms. The forest loomed before them, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow all light. Even the moonlight appeared to dim as it touched the twisted branches of Deadwood Vale. "Remember what Thomas said," Michael spoke softly, switching on his flashlight. "Zero resents the light. It weakens him." Elizabeth nodded, her grip tightening on her own flashlight. "And we stay together. No matter what happens, we don't split up." They formed a tight circle, each facing outward with their lights pointed into the darkness. With a collective deep breath, they began their journey into Deadwood Vale, their footsteps crunching on the brittle, colorless grass. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. The air grew dense, heavy with an unnatural chill that penetrated their jackets. The usual sounds of night crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against their ears. "I don't like this," David muttered, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine unease. "It feels like the forest is watching us." "It probably is," Gabriella whispered back, her flashlight beam sweeping across the twisted trunks. "Stay focused." They moved deeper, following a barely visible path that wound between the gnarled trees. Elizabeth's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, searching for any sign of Ryder or the monster that controlled him. A sudden crack echoed through the stillness, causing them all to freeze. "What was that?" Penelope hissed, her voice trembling. "Branch breaking," Jonas replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "Has to be." They waited, hearts pounding, but nothing emerged from the darkness. After a tense moment, they continued forward, their formation tighter than before. The whispering started gradually, so faint at first that Elizabeth thought she was imagining it. But as they progressed, the voices grew clearer, surrounding them from all sides. "Leave. Turn back. Death awaits." Michael's jaw clenched. "Ignore them. They're trying to scare us off." "Well, it's working," David replied, his voice strained. Elizabeth kept her gaze straight ahead, refusing to be deterred. "Ryder's in here somewhere. We need to find him." A soft laugh echoed through the trees, not the eerie whispers they'd heard before, but something worse. Something familiar. It was Ryder's laugh, but twisted, corrupted into something dark and mocking. Nothing much came of the sound afterwards, despite the repeated shines of flashlights around the dead foliage. "As much as I hate to say this, how are we going to find him if we're just wandering aimlessly?" Jonas asked, his voice tight with tension. "This forest is huge." Elizabeth's mind raced. She hadn't considered this problem. Deadwood Vale stretched for miles, and Ryder could be anywhere within its cursed boundaries. They could search for days and never find him if they didn't have some kind of plan. We need to draw him out, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Or rather, draw Zero out. And how exactly do we do that? David asked, sweeping his flashlight beam across a cluster of twisted trees. Jonas took a deep breath and said, I believe that despite our reservations on the idea of splitting up, we don't have a choice but to consider it, Jonas said, his expression grim but resolute nonetheless. Not alone, but 3 groups of 2. We cover more ground that way, and we're still not alone. Michael shook his head immediately. No way. That's exactly what Zero would want, to separate us, make us vulnerable. Jonas might be right, Elizabeth said reluctantly. We're not getting anywhere like this, and time isn't on our side. But we need something more, a way to actually attract Zero's attention. After a moment of consideration, Elizabeth just sighed in defeat. If we stay together, it'll only slow us down. We need to find Ryder before this crap gets any worse than it needs to be. She looked around at the group, determination hardening her features. But Jonas is right, we go in pairs, no one alone. I still don't like it, Penelope muttered, but she didn't argue further. David stepped forward, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. Don't worry, Penelope, he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm sure we'll be just fine. If anything goes wrong, you can always call me for a rescue. Jonas and I are practically invincible together, right? He looked over his shoulder at Jonas, who merely raised an eyebrow. Right, Jonas said dryly, adjusting his gear. Invincible. Just try not to do anything stupid, David. For once. Gabriella giggled, her laughter light and contagious, despite her posture being tense and unfocused. Honestly, you guys, she said, looking at Michael, who was bouncing on his heels. I love how everything's a joke to you. But remember, we're looking for Ryder. This is serious. Michael made a weak smile. Of course, but hey, a little humor goes a long way when things get dark, right? Besides, who else would keep you all from losing your minds out here? He looked to Gabriella, who rolled her eyes but could suppress a tiny smile. Gabriella rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. Just don't get us killed with your jokes, Michael. Elizabeth cleared her throat, bringing everyone's attention back to the task at hand. All right, here's the plan. Michael and Gabriella, you two head east. David and Jonas, take the western path. Penelope and I will go straight north. We'll cover more ground that way. And if anyone finds Ryder or Zero? Penelope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't engage, Elizabeth said firmly. The last thing we want right now is to confront him alone. If you find something, flash twice. If you need any help, just wave your light around. Our phones is an alternative. Send 3 quick texts in the group chat. That'll be our signal. And if our phones don't work? Jonas asked, already testing his signal strength. Not surprising, we're getting barely 1 bar out here. Then use these, Michael said, pulling out 3 small emergency whistles from his backpack. 3 short blasts. Should carry far enough in the silence. Elizabeth nodded, taking one of the whistles and slipping it around her neck. We meet back here if nothing comes of our search. Great, Penelope muttered sarcastically. One of us is bound to end up with a creepy ghost or something. Just don't get possessed, okay? Don't worry, sis. You've got me, Elizabeth said with a wry smile. Besides, no demons getting past me. With their positions set, the group took their first steps into the forest, the wind rustling the branches above them, a sound like distant whispers. The trees seemed to close in as they ventured deeper, each path leading them further into the heart of the darkness. David and Jonas ventured to the western path, the tension between them palpable. David was already making offhand comments, trying to lighten the mood, but Jonas wasn't biting. David, Jonas said, stopping to inspect the ground for any unusual tracks. This isn't some fun adventure. We're in a race against time, and the stakes couldn't be higher. David sighed and leaned against a tree, crossing his arms. I know. But you can't expect me to go through this without cracking a joke here and there. Besides, we're a team. There's a need balance. We can't all be doom and gloom. Jonas gave him a pointed look. You're right about one thing, you balance out my overthinking. He paused and wiped his brow, feeling the weight of the situation. But if we're not careful, We're all going to end up in the same place Ryder did. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Penelope moved to the northern path, the atmosphere thick with the sound of distant, eerie calls. Penelope walked silently, her eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. Elizabeth kept her hand on the hilt of her knife, the weight comforting despite the situation. "Elizabeth, what if we don't find Ryder in time?" Penelope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll find him," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady. "We have to. We're the only ones who can." Penelope wasn't convinced, but she didn't say anything. She wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially when it came to protecting her family. The trees seemed to grow thicker around them, and the path narrower. Penelope glanced over at Elizabeth, who appeared unfazed, but Penelope knew her better than anyone. She could sense the worry beneath the surface. "Look," Penelope began, "I know we're both worried about Ryder. But we've been through worse, right? We just need to stick together." Elizabeth smiled at her. "You're right. We'll stick together." Michael and Gabriella headed eastward, their flashlights cutting through the dense fog that seemed to thicken with each step they took. The beam from Michael's light trembled slightly, a reflection of the anxiety he was trying desperately to hide. "You think he's still in there?" Gabriella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ryder, I mean. Not just, whatever's controlling him." Michael nodded firmly. "He has to be." Thomas said, "Possession doesn't completely erase the host. Ryder's fighting back, I'm sure of it." They pushed deeper into the forest, their flashlight beams cutting through the murky darkness like blades. The twisted trees seemed to lean toward them, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers as they passed. "I wish we had a better plan than just wandering around hoping to find him," Gabriella said, sweeping her light across a patch of dead undergrowth. Michael nodded grimly. "Me too, but what choice do we have? This place, it doesn't exactly follow normal rules." Suddenly, a shadow flitted across their path, vanishing into the underbrush. Both of them froze. "Okay, that was creepy," Gabriella murmured, her playful demeanor shifting into something more serious. Michael squinted, but saw nothing. "Probably just a squirrel. Or, something worse. The stories are probably right about the cursed part of this place." Gabriella's hand gripped her flashlight a little tighter as she stepped forward, her usual brightness now shadowed by caution. "Stay close, Mike. If it's really Ryder out here, we need to be ready." As the group continued down their respective paths, they each felt the weight of the darkness pressing in. The veil had its secrets, and as they ventured deeper into the unknown, they couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. But they couldn't stop. They wouldn't stop. Not until Zero is down and Ryder was safe. Somewhere out there, Ryder was waiting. And no matter what, they would find him. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows through the twisted trees of Deadwood Vale. Hours had passed since the group split to search for Ryder, their flashlights flickering over clearings, underbrush, and ancient, moss-covered stones. They had called his name over and over but received nothing in return but silence, as if the forest itself had swallowed the sound. When they regrouped beneath a hollow tree marked with deep claw marks, frustration and exhaustion weighed heavy. "Nothing," Gabriella sighed, wiping dirt from her cheek. "Not even a footprint." Michael shook his head. "Whatever trail Ryder left, it's cold now. Zero's smart, he's hiding him somewhere deep." David paced back and forth, fists clenched. "This doesn't make sense. If Ryder's alive, there has to be something, a clue, a message, anything." Jonas knelt beside a patch of disturbed earth, squinting in the dim light. "We can start forming theories. If Zero wants Ryder alive, he's not going to kill him outright. He's probably being used, maybe as bait or a vessel. Somewhere remote, protected. Then where the hell is that?" Penelope muttered. That's when Elizabeth froze mid-step, her nose wrinkling. Her expression shifted from confusion to horror. "Wait, do you smell that?" The others paused. Penelope stepped beside her. "What is it?" Elizabeth's voice came out low. "Blood." Everyone turned toward the direction she was staring, just beyond a thick wall of trees, where the light seemed to bend unnaturally. The stench hit them seconds later, sharp, metallic, suffocating. "I know that smell," David whispered, his face paling. "It's the same as when we found those bodies being carried out by the police." Without hesitation, Elizabeth pushed forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the twisted branches. The others followed, their lights joining hers as they broke through the dense foliage into a small clearing. What they found made them stop dead in their tracks. A circle of mangled corpses lay arranged in a grotesque pattern, their limbs contorted at impossible angles. Some were fresh, their blood still glistening in the flashlight beams, while others have been decomposed to the point where bone gleamed through rotting flesh. The putrid smell was overwhelming now, a physical presence that made Gabriella gag and turn away. Elizabeth's heart thundered in her chest, and Penelope's breath caught in her throat before she even saw it. There, at the base of a broken tree, were two familiar bodies. No. Elizabeth dropped to her knees beside them. No, no, no. Mom. Dad. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, their bodies mangled beyond recognition. Blood stained the earth beneath them, black in the dim light. Elizabeth's hands hovered over them, trembling, unable to touch the horror before her. This can't be real, she whispered, her voice breaking. They were at home, they were safe. Penelope collapsed beside her sister, a raw, guttural sound escaping her throat. Mom. Dad. She reached out, fingers brushing against their mother's cold cheek. No, please, no. Gabriella covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Michael stood frozen, his usual playfulness stripped away, his jaw clenched tight. David's fists trembled. Son of a, he kicked a nearby tree with a rage that shook his entire frame. This was Zero. He's taunting us. He wants us to break. Jonas knelt beside the bodies, searching desperately for any sign, any chance that this was a trick, an illusion. But it wasn't. They've been dead for hours. Penelope stumbled away from the scene, her voice hoarse. Where's Lillian? Her eyes scanned the area wildly. Where's our baby sister? Elizabeth lurched to her feet, panic surging through her veins as she frantically searched the grotesque display for any sign of their youngest sister. Lillian. She screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. Lillian. She's not here, Jonas said, carefully examining the surrounding area. None of these bodies are hers. The relief that washed over the group was palpable but short-lived. That doesn't mean she's safe, Michael warned, his voice unusually grave. If Zero found your parents, he could have found her too. Elizabeth stood slowly, her face pale but hardening into steel. Her hand found Penelope's, gripping it tight. We're going to find her. And Ryder. And we're going to end Zero. David looked at the group, fire in his eyes. Then what the hell are we waiting for? The silence that followed was shattered by a distant, haunting laugh, Ryder's laugh, but distorted and hollow. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere at once. You hear that? Michael whispered, his flashlight beam sweeping frantically through the darkness. Elizabeth's grip tightened on her own light, her grief momentarily pushed aside by a surge of determination. He's close. He wants us to follow. It could be a trap, Jonas warned, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew they had no choice. Trap or not, we need to find that monster before he hurts anyone else, Elizabeth said, her voice hardened by grief. If he has Lillian. She couldn't finish the sentence. The thought was too terrible to voice. Penelope wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her expression shifting from devastation to cold fury. Mom and Dad, they weren't even part of this. They didn't know anything about Deadwood Vale. Her voice trembled. Zero's going to pay for this. They knew now, this wasn't just about saving Ryder anymore. Zero had made it personal. He wanted them to feel hopeless. Broken. But they're not going to let their grief consume them. Same groups, Elizabeth ordered. But this time, we don't leave any stone unturned. Every branch, every shadow, every breath of wind, we check it. And if you find anything, you scream. This time, no one argued and split once again, with each pair heading in different directions. Their purpose has been renewed, their grief and rage fueling a desperate resolution that burns more brighter than the beams from their flashlights. The forest seemed to shift and contort around them, branches from the dead trees creaking, shadows dancing across their vision, and dead, monochromatic leaves crunching with every step they take. Michael and Gabriella moved as quickly as their legs can take, now quiet from the grueling spectacle they have encountered. Gabriella held her flashlight high, searching the trees with her lips pressed together tightly and glancing at Michael, who had this look on his face that renders to be unlike him. Knowing that it's for the best to leave him to his thoughts, Gabriella didn't say a peep. However, she couldn't contain her curiosity and leaned to him. "You're going to be okay, Mike?" she asked quietly. Michael took a moment before breathing in and out through his nose. "Can't say I will," he said, still looking ahead while flashing his flashlight in every direction possible. "But once we find Ryder and kill that freak who took him, then maybe I can feel a bit of closure." Gabriella nodded in understanding and said nothing else, standing upright to continue to look for Ryder. David and Jonas moved with focus that can put a laser to shame. David's rage burned within his gut, his hand tightly gripped on the flashlight that Jonas was worried that it would break. Despite the rage bubbling within him, Jonas placed a hand on David's shoulder in an attempt to keep him grounded. "I understand your rage, but don't lose yourself in this. I'm sure we'll find them as soon as we can," Jonas said, receiving a slight shrug from David to get his friend's hand off, which Jonas respectfully stepped away from him. "I won't lose myself," David replied through tightened teeth. "But if I see Zero before you do, there won't be anything left of that devil when I'm done with him." Jonas sighed through his nose and simply nodded. He knew not to press the issue further when David is close to being knees deep into his rage, and simply shined at every nook and cranny of the cursed foliage. Elizabeth and Penelope searched in silence, hearts pounding with grief and dread. Penelope had tears on her cheeks, but her face was set. They lost their parents to Zero's attack, they're not going to lose their baby sister. They pushed deeper into the vale, the trees becoming more like cages than woods now. "Lillian has to be okay," Penelope whispered, her voice raw from emotion. Elizabeth kept her gaze at the forest in front of her. "She will be. Let's just hope Ms. Yates found her while she's still moving," Elizabeth replied firmly, knowing well how close their neighbor is with them. Despite the hardened look on her face, the sight of their mangled parents is still fresh in her mind. The group knows that somewhere in the branches, Ryder is still alive and Zero is only biding his time to tick them down one by one. The deeper Michael and Gabriella pushed into Deadwood Vale, the more the forest felt alive, breathing, whispering, watching. But amidst the darkness, a voice echoed faintly, weak, familiar. "Michael. Gabriella." It called out, causing the two to freeze like their feet are iced together on the ground. The two raised their flashlight to locate the familiar sound. "Did you hear that, Gabby?" Michael said, his voice low and shaky. Gabriella nodded, her heart thudding against her ribcage like a drummer slamming their instrument in a band. "Yeah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was Ryder, but where is he?" They sprinted through the underbrush, ducking beneath thorned branches and leaping over roots. The voice came again, closer this time. "Over here. I'm right here." It rang out, leading the two to where the source is heard. And that's when they saw him. Ryder stood at the center of a small clearing of the vale, illuminated slightly by the moonlight that slashed through the thin canopy above. His figure is ashen from head to toe, his clothes are more torn than before, but he stood eerily still as a statue. A wide grin stretched his face, his pupils are now narrowed and feline like slits that they have never seen him with. Michael was reluctant on getting any closer, but Gabriella was relieved and hurried to him. "Ryder." Gabriella called out in relief, but was suddenly yanked back by Michael, who got a grip on the back of her shirt. "Gabby, wait," Michael said as he yanked her back, causing her to break free from his grasp and look at him, startled by this. "Mike, what are you doing?" "It's Ryder. He's right there," she protested, but Michael was sensing that something was off way more than it already is and shook his head. "Well, yes, it may be him, but there's something up," he said, keeping his gaze on who seems to be Ryder. "Remember what he looked like when we first saw him? He had that terrified look on his face. Screaming. Now, he's smiling, and his eyes are now different." Ryder tilted his head, his grin never leaving his face as he took a step forward, causing Michael and Gabriella to take a step back. "What do you ever mean, Mikey?" "It's me, I promise on my mother. I was just scared before, but look at me now, I'm unharmed," he coaxed, his voice sweet and calm. "Let's go home and leave Deadwood Vale behind us, yeah." Gabriella looks at Ryder, then at Michael, and back at Ryder. "It sounds like him," she said softly, now torn on whether or not to trust Ryder or to keep her distance away from him. Michael didn't take his eyes off Ryder. "I don't think that's the problem, "Gabby," he said, watching as Ryder's grin not wavering a bit while the forest seemed to hold its breath. Ryder took another step forward, prompting the two to back up a step again. "Come on, Mikey and Gabby," Ryder coaxed further, his voice getting lower and lower. "We can all go home now, everything is all okay." Michael narrowed his eyes, brows furrowing. "You're not blinking," he pointed out, causing Ryder to tilt his head further as his arms quivered and convulsed. "Why would I need to blink when I'm finally awake, Mikey?" Ryder asked, his eyes darkening as his smile began to widen to the point it appeared inhuman. Gabriella latched her arms onto Michael's bicep, shaking like a leaf at the biting cold breeze that slowly began to build up. "How do we know it's you, Ryder?" she called out, finally causing the man in front of them to stop getting any closer. The silence was deafening around the area, before Ryder breathed in a raspy breath before his eyes shifted into twin voids of inky black before a thorny tentacle sprouted out of the ground and shot itself like a bullet. Michael's instincts flared up as he pushed Gabriella out the way just as the tentacle got a firm grip on his ankle and yanked him off his feet. Without giving Michael the time to fight back, the tentacle began dragging him across the dried dirt. Gabriella got up from being shoved and scrambled after him. "Michael!" she screamed as she grabbed his arms and tried pulling with all of her strength. However, trying to free Michael from a tentacle that has an iron grip on him is like trying to fight against a moving car with nothing but a flimsy rope. Whatever caught Michael is winning, but Gabriella isn't willing to give up. Not after finally finding Ryder, whether in this state or back to normal. Michael gritted his teeth so hard, they may break from the pressure, as he clutched Gabriella's wrists as tightly as he could. "It's no use. Gabby, you need to run and alert the others," he barked. Gabriella shook her head as she pulled harder. "No. I am not leaving you behind," she shrieked, her heels scraping against the ground, picking up dirt and chipped wood. "Run!" Michael barked, even louder. Tears were falling down Gabriella's eyes, but she refused to let go. Her eyes darted on the man who she doesn't know anymore. He simply stood motionless as the black tendrils erupted from his bare feet like roots, one of which is pulling Michael back towards him. In a flash of instinct, and remembering what Thomas had said, Gabriella snatched her flashlight from where she dropped it and pointed it directly at the monster's face. Once the beam hit his eyes, the effect was immediate. The monster reeled back and covered his face with clawed hands as an unearthly screech tore from his mouth. Smoke hissed from his skin where the light had struck, and the tentacle that snatched Michael's ankle snapped away like a burnt rope. He gasped and scrambled to his feet as Gabriella grabbed Michael's arm and bolted with him in tow, dragging him across the veil. Behind them, the shrieking had stopped, and a deeper and more monstrous growl ripped through the air as Zero fully revealed himself, cracking through Ryder's countenance as thunderous footsteps echoed through the area. "Keep going, keep going, keep going. Don't stop running," Michael panted as they crashed through a dry underbrush, leaving cuts on their arms and legs. They didn't pay no attention to the pain, they knew they need to return and warn the others. Finally, after running through the darkness of what feels like hours, they spotted flashlights flickering in the trees. Elizabeth, Penelope, David, Jonas, the two screamed, their voice ragged from running. The group bursts out from the shadows just as Gabriella and Michael collapsed to the ground, panting and bloodied. "Gabby, Mike, what's wrong?" Elizabeth asked, concern in her voice as she watched them recover from winding themselves. Michael took deep breath and lifted his head up to look at the group. We found him. We found Ryder," he gasped, wiping the sweat off with his sleeve. Gabriella nodded, her face paler than the tree bark surrounding them. "It was Ryder," she began, catching her breath. "But, it's not him anymore, he changed, he's a monster now. Zero took over." The group are stunned into silence, but Elizabeth shook her head. "We need to find and repel Zero from Ryder before he does," was all Elizabeth could say before a loud scream shattered her train of thought. "Let go of David, you brute." Jonas's yelling voice echoed through the veil, raw and desperate as David threw expletives left and right as the two let out strained grunts of exertion. The four immediately ran to the source of the sound. Elizabeth and Penelope were leading Michael and Gabriella, who the latter has grabbed the former by his wrist, pulling him towards the sound of Jonas and David's physical struggle, their hearts hammering wildly in their chests. The four pushed through the trees and dead bushes following the frantic shouts and strains until they broke into a small clearing opposite of the one Michael and Gabriella found Ryder in. Jonas and David had their hands gripping on each other's forearms, struggling from the grip of the black, writhing tentacle that got an ironclad grip on David's leg, trying to drag him backward into the darkness while attempting to pry him off of Jonas's weakening grip. Elizabeth immediately rushed over to help Jonas fight against the tentacle. Gabriella joined in while Michael and Penelope flashed their lights aimlessly around the forest to find Zero, hoping to get the monster to lose control of the tentacle. Unable to locate him, the two immediately shined their light on the tentacle, hoping that the illumination could weaken the stubborn tactile organ. However, the shadows seemed to grow thicker and more alive, twisting around David like how a serpent constricts around their prey. "Get him off!" Jonas cried out, his own voice breaking as he, Elizabeth, and Gabriella fought with every ounce of their combined strength. However, the tentacle is relentless as more sprouted out of the earth and wrapped around David's torso and limbs, pulling him like a rag doll toward the depths of the forest. Frantic as they are, Michael and Penelope shone their flashlights either on the tentacles or around, searching for Zero, just hoping they'll make him release David. But all they could hear was the sound of leaves crackling beneath the shifting shadows and the low, guttural laughter of a being far darker than they can comprehend. Suddenly, with startling and violent force, David was flung into a nearby tree with sickening speed by the tentacles. "Holy dash!" was all he could say before the sound of his body hitting the dense trunk. The sound was absolutely awful and loud, like a porcelain doll's face being shattered after getting smashed into the ground. The horrifying sound of blood gushing, rushing, spraying until it finally stopped made the group stood frozen, horror and dismay creeping into their beings as the sound reached their ears. "No!" Gabriella choked out, her voice hoarse with terror and grief. Elizabeth had a lump in her throat, but she quickly swallowed it down before reluctantly shining her flashlight towards the source of the noise. Her hands were shaking like a leaf, but her grip never wavered. She hoped what she and the group heard wasn't real. What she saw caught her breath in the most horrific way imaginable. The group's eyes widened in horror at the sight. There, sprawled at the base of the dead tree, was David's body and what's left of his head. What remained was a bloody and mangled mess of bone fragments, bits of flesh, and chunks of brain matter. His eyes are sprawled away from the gruesome piles of what used to be his head, and the only semblance of him was his contorted and broken form. Sharp pieces of his broken bones pierced his skin like he was impaled from the inside out, exposed in the cold air. Blood has been pooling around him from his neck and wounds in dark, sticky patches as the stench of his death and blood stung their nostrils like a bad odor. Gabriella gasped in horror as her legs unbuckled beneath her shaky frame and staggered back, her hands pressing against her retching mouth as the reality hit her like a truck. She turned, desperate to release of what's building up in her mouth before stumbling to the nearest tree just a few feet away from the gruesome sight. She leaned against it, her stomach lurching violently before losing the battle to her nausea and hurled, emptying the gross contents of her stomach onto the ground. Michael went over to stroke her back gently as she coughed and gasped for air, trying to steady herself, though the image of David's mangled, lifeless mass of a body was burned into her mind while Michael gently held her hair back, making sure none of her bile gets in her orange strands. Gabriella remained hunched over, groaning as she shook due to lightheadedness before weakly thanking Michael while he gently held her, patiently waiting for her to recover. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, Penelope, and Jonas stood frozen as their flashlights shook while staring at the ghastly scene before them. Tears were streaming down their faces as they hung their head down to mourn for their deceased friend. Penelope felt her hands clench into fists, her body is trembling as her teeth clenched, rage and grief mixed in like gasoline and water. "He's gone," was all Penelope could say before Elizabeth hugged her tightly. The two locked into their embrace as Jonas fell to his knees and closed his eyes. His face paled as he tried to fight back tears before Michael and Gabriella returned. "I'm going to make that monster pay for what he did to David. I swear it." Michael growled through his clenched teeth, his eyes burned with fury as the flames of his grief and anger mixed together into thick molasses. Despite the anger and the sadness around the group, the air in the clearing felt incredibly suffocating, and their emotions was heavy and unbearable. Each of them felt the weight of David's death, but the time to mourn is not there. Not yet, at least. Jonas stood up, his eyes opening to reveal the lingering sadness, but newfound resolve. "We need to keep moving," he finally said, though his voice is still breaking. "We need to do this for David, for Ryder. We can't let Zero get away with what he had done, we can't let this death stop us now." They nodded, wiping away any remaining tears that were streaming down their faces. While the grief within them was thick, a deep ache raw in their chests, they cannot wallow in it. They know Jonas is right because if they don't stop Zero, there will be more casualties before they can find a chance to move. They all stood in the clearing, gathered around the body of their fallen friend, but their resolve slowly, but surely, hardened. Gabriella wiped her mouth, still pale from the ordeal, but stood tall. "We'll find that devil and make sure he wishes he never entered this world ever again," she said, her voice now low as she gripped her hands into fists. The others gave a single, firm nod. With David's death weighed heavily on their shoulders, the group took one final look at the body. They all crossed their hearts for David, then pressed forward while their emotions seared into their chests. The need for saving Ryder, stopping the Devil of Shadows himself, surged within the group despite it all. They won't let David's sudden death be in vain. During their silent stroll, a low chuckle echoed throughout the forest. This prompted them to flash their light around to find the source of the sound. The air was thick with a sense of dread and grief as the image of David's corpse replayed in their minds like a broken record. No one uttered a word, not because they were scared, but because words simply couldn't describe of what they all felt. The only sound filling their ears was the crunching of dead leaves and grass blades underneath their shoes. The vale is now eerily quiet despite the echo-y crow they had heard earlier. The silence is too palpable, as if Deadwood Vale had gone still despite of what had transpired. There was no hoot of a distant owl or the rustle of any unseen creatures that could have kept it from falling into absolute silence. Every single step they take felt heavier than the previous. Then, it came once again. That same low, guttural chuckle that echoed around them this time. It sounded mocking, cold, inhuman even. The sound slithered through the trees like a snake, bouncing from branch to branch, rendering itself as impossible to be properly tracked. The group froze as they spun around with their flashlights raised, looking for Zero. "Where is he?" Jonas hissed, finally breaking the group's silence as he swept his light across the tree trunks. "Where the hell is Zero? Come on, come on, come on," Michael repeated, lashing his flashlight around from tree to tree. With a sudden and loud snap, a tentacle burst from the ground beneath Elizabeth, wrapping around her ankle and yanking her down before she could get a chance to scream. Gabriella shouted an incoherent word, rushing to grab her, but then another appendage erupted and snatched her too, coiling around her waist and dragging her downward as well. "Not again!" Michael screamed as he reached for their hands and pulled, with Jonas helping on Gabriella while Penelope helped on Elizabeth. They all shouted as tried to fight against the tentacles, but the appendages surged faster now. One by one, each of them was grabbed, limbs flailing, screams muffled by the dirt as they were being dragged towards the forest floor. Their scuffle resulted in them ultimately losing their flashlights and equipment as they flew from either the group's hands or their bodies, clattering uselessly into the brush before they flickered out. Darkness then swallowed the clearing the moment the equipment died out. They all screamed as they felt the terrain crack beneath them, splitting open like a mouth before they were fused into the ground one by one, as if they are being eaten alive by the forest itself. They struggled against the tentacles, but it was all in vain. Amidst their scuffle, Zero watched over with that huge grinning maw on his face as he gestured for the tentacles to drag them deeper into the earth. The group could barely move, only their heads are free, each of them are partially entombed in the forest's dry floor. The roots and vines slithered and coiled around them like snakes preparing to feast on their prey. The chuckle returned, but much more closer now, more deeper. Then, in came the voice that rang around the group despite their ears are being filled with dirt and litters of leaves. So brave, so adventurous, and yet so fragile, so pathetic. While not spoken aloud, it echoed in their minds, cold and wet like freezing water slowly sliding down on their spines. Elizabeth tried shifting to turn her head to find the source of the sound, her strained grunting getting softer and softer. Penelope attempted to reach out to her sister, but the tentacles held firm, as if preventing her from moving an inch. Michael tried biting into the appendages to get them to let go, but it only made things worse by it coiling dangerously close to his neck, waiting for him to bite again, as if daring him to even try again. Jonas has made some progress to at least managing to get his neck back at surface level, but it meant nothing as more appendages sprawled out and began pulling him down more and more to stay in the same level as the others in the group. Gabriella is gasping and choking from the dirt as she constantly shielded her eyes from the flying dust from blinding her while the tactile organs pulled her down further into the soil. "You have arrived for your friend," the voice continued, amusement etched in its otherwise scorning tone. "But he isn't yours anymore. His body belongs to me, and all you're going to achieve is a more painful death than you can ever imagine." Ahead of the group, the shadows twisted and split as Ryder emerged. His eyes were pitch black once again, but his smile is eerily calm in contrast to the huge grin Michael and Gabriella had encountered earlier. His body was no longer trembling as if in fear but brimming with something else entirely. Power and absolute madness. Why do you all fight like this? Ryder asked the group, his voice layered differently, something to that of an ancient being who speaks in an echoey voice. I am at peace now, and soon you will be too, just let it all happen and all of your troubles will disappear in the blink of an eye. Elizabeth thrashed and struggled against the ink-black vines. Ryder, please. Resist Zero's control. You're stronger than this. I know it. Yeah, you had struggled before, but you managed every time when the opportunity has risen. Just because this is holding you back, doesn't mean you should let it control you. Ryder simply stepped forward, his head tilting to the side curiously as if trying to understand something alien. You mourn the dead in front of you, yet you fear the thought of death itself. So, tell me, what is the difference between the lines? The others began to fight harder, writhing against the dirt of the forest's hold, but it wasn't any of use for them. The ground felt like quicksand, only slightly faster, tightening around them, drawing the strength from their own fear. Michael tried and failed to grab the tentacles that were close to his neck, Jonas's fingers were slipping from his grip on the grass, and Penelope kept trying to wriggle out of her constraints to no avail. We'll save you, Ryder. Gabriella gasped out, still trying to shift even an inch. I don't care what that monster has done to you, we will get you back. We will bring you back home. Safe and sound. This made Ryder pause, and for a flicker of a second, something behind his eyes twitched. The black voids faltered just for a blink, but then they returned as that cursed grin returned on his face. His form shifted and contorted to monstrous proportions as he stepped back to watch as their heads are now underneath the soil. I'm afraid that you're too late to help now. He simply said as the forest began to move more. The forest lets out a low, monotonous groan as the group was being pulled deeper. Then, the soil around them began to slowly close all around them. The soil was cold and wet, pressing tightly against their own skin. Dirt began to fill their noses and ears as the pressure around their limbs intensified with every passing second, like invisible jaws slowly closing. The forest continued to groan as it pulsed around them, breathing in unison with the corruption that currently dwells within Ryder's body. All the group can now do was scream. Ryder, please. Elizabeth cried, her voice hoarse and raw as tears fall down her face. I know you're still there. Fight it. Her words cracked through the oppressive silence, but the only response she received was the subtle rumble of the forest consuming them further. The earth had reached to her chest, pinning her tightly that she could barely expand her lungs to breathe for air. Ryder, please look at us. Penelope shouted, her voice sharp and desperate. Remember who you are. Remember Lillian. Remember everyone. You're not a monster, Ryder, you're our friend. Elizabeth's sweetheart. Ryder simply watched over, the grin never leaving his face, but his eyes were twitching another flicker. A ripple in the void that consumed him. His arms are now quivering again, but it did nothing to stop the burial. Jonas, who has dirt already reaching his neck, coughed and forced out, you used to tell me that I was the calm one, do you remember that? You told me to always think with my heart before thinking with my head. So do that now, Ryder. Honor what you had preached to me. Gabriella was inconsolably sobbing now, her tears mixing with the grim that had smudged across her face. Please, Ryder. Please. You were always the one who pulled us together when we can do that for ourselves. You're the one who made us better. This thing is not who you are. It's just using you for its gain. Michael was only barely able to move his jaw, his head now the only thing free above the earth. We're your family when your parents were gone. You never gave up on us. We didn't give up on you, not now, not ever. There was silence again, with the only sounds being the creaking groans of Deadwood Vale breathing around them. Ryder stood motionless, still possessed by the dark presence, but is now visibly shaking, hands twitching by his sides as his shadow flickered, and in those eyes, there is something that is struggling to surface. Please, Ryder. Elizabeth pleaded, her voice cracking. If there's even a shred of you in there, don't let this be how it ends. The soil had already begun to reach her chin as Penelope was submerged up to her mouth, unable to plead now. Jonas is fading into the dirt fast while Gabriella could only breathe in shallow gasps, her chest is bound tightly by the vice of the earth. Ryder watched while the shaking happened, and one thing he heard was Elizabeth croaking out to him. I love you. Then, one by one, the group is fully submerged into the soil while Ryder just watched with that blank stare grin on his face. The shaking had stopped as the low voice then muttered, "That was easier than I thought it would be." With that, Ryder's whole body was encased in shadows as it puddled into the ground and faded into the soil where the group had been buried into. To be concluded in part 2.